Welcome to 20-0 Tactics with me, James The Loremaster Lammin, where you join me for the latest instalment in an 8-part series as we discuss the tactics for the 8 laws of battle magic from the core rulebook. Today we're going to be discussing the law of metal, and I'm going to begin by outlining how this video will be structured. Firstly, we'll give an overview of the law of metal using our competitive rating system for the laws of magic. This can be found on the rating system page on triplecrownwargaming.com and is the same system that we use in our deep dive videos. Once we've established this, we'll discuss getting the most out of the law of metal on your wizards before we move on to finally take a look at each of the armies which have access to law of metal, and in that section we'll cover maximising the law of magic within each of the factions. So let's begin by getting that rating for the law of metal. Now, the law of metal is themed around alchemy, and on the tabletop this translates to a group of spells that primarily manipulates the armour saves of you or your opponent's models. Whilst the law is often seen as less effective against poorly armoured opponents, it does still boast arguably the most consistent unit killer spell in 8th edition. The law can be taken on quite a large number of factions, however it does tend to appear only on 2 or 3 of them regularly in competitive play. So let's take a brief look at each of the 7 spells and get this law's competitive rating. Now, if you've not seen the system before, we'll give the law a score out of 24 based on the following 6 criteria: variety of spells, power and frequency of the law attribute, average spell range, spell flexibility, average casting value, and the quality of the signature spell. So let's begin with the law attribute, metal shifting. Magic missiles and direct damage spells from this law do not have a strength value. Instead, their to wound score is equal to the unmodified armor save of the enemy they are targeting. Rolls of a 1 to wound will still fail. If you have no armor save, you can't be wounded by these spells, and the hits ignore armor saves and have flaming attacks. So obviously this is excellent against well armoured targets and less good against, well, poorly armoured targets. This means the law of metal doesn't lend itself to chaff clearance very well, and the attribute is only actually triggered by 2 of the spells in the whole law, which isn't great. So there's some obvious good and bad points with this attribute, and we're going to take a look at it in respect to the spells in the law to unpack it further. It is worth saying that the spells that don't trigger this law attribute are pretty powerful in their own right, but I'd still like a little bit more from this law attribute. So on to spells now, and we're going to begin with the signature spell, Searing Doom. This one is a magic missile with a range of 24 inches and is cast on a 10+. The target takes d6 hits with the metal shifting attribute we just looked at. Now, this is a high cast value for a signature spell, but it can be a game-changing damage dealer. Enemy knights, lone characters, chariots, or even monsters have to be very concerned about this spell. Combine that with the fact the hits are flaming, and you can say goodbye to regeneration saves as well. This is a strong spell, but it is a bit specific in its target, especially as you want to have an impact on the game with a spell that's a sort of 10+ to cast. There is one final shining light, however. You can boost this spell to do 2d6 hits instead of just d6 hits. Now that can melt large chunks of your opponent's best units. But if you do so, the cast value does jump to a 20+, so that's not going to be easy for a low level wizard. So let's take a look at spell 1, and that's Plague of Rust. The first hex spell in the law is cast on a 7+ and has a range of 24 inches. The spell targets a single enemy unit, and they suffer a -1 penalty to their armour save for the rest of the game. The spell can be cast multiple times on the same unit as well, to stack up the modifier, and the effect remains on the enemy unit even if the caster is sort of slain or flees off the table. Now that's a pretty unique effect. Like its signature spell companion, it can be boosted as well. In this case, it increases its range to 48 inches for a cast value of 10+. Which is pretty reasonable. Now, I don't need to explain how good reducing enemy armour saves is, and what's even better is that the law attribute states you wound enemies on unmodified armour saves with metal shifting. So you can reduce a unit of enemy knights from, say, a 2+ armor save to a 4+ armor save using a couple of Plague of Rusts across some turns, but you'll still wound them on a 2+ if you hit them with Syrian Doom. That's good. Again, it's not as good if your opponent sort of is quite lightly armoured, and that problem unfortunately is compounded by the fact that you're not going to want to swap this for the signature spell, Searing Doom, in that scenario either. So on to spell number 2 now, and that's Enchanted Blades of Aben. This one is an augment spell, so no lore attribute. However, the target unit gains +1 to all to hit rolls, that's shooting and combat, and all of their attacks are armor piercing and magical as well. Now, I find with the Lore of Metal that there often isn't a lot to cut between the quality of quite a few of the spells in this lore, but I do think this one stands out. In fact, I'd go as far as to say I'm almost always looking to get this one. It's good on such a wide variety of units, particularly if you don't have reroll to hits. Plus, it's got a 24-inch range and is only a 9+ to cast. That's very good for both of those factors. Oh, and you can boost the range further if you need to as well, to 48, and the cast value only goes to a 12+ there. Now that's a great return of range for such a small increase to the cast value. You'll love to see it. So looking at spell number 3 now, and this one is Glittering Robe. Our final augment spell, this one targets a friendly unit within 12 inches and they gain the Scaly Skin 5+ special rule. It's another 9+ to cast and can be boosted. However, in this instance, it will hit all friendly models within 12 instead of an increase to the range on a 16+. Okay, so this is the second spell I'm almost always looking to get. It has so much synergy, particularly if you don't start with Scaly Skin, and well, that's actually quite common that you won't. Plus, Scaly Skin stacks with other types of armour or mounts, so I'm sure I don't need to explain why suddenly improving your armour save by 2 is competitive. What I think really stands out about this spell, however, is how it can be boosted to potentially hit, well, your whole army if you've placed yourself well. It's also the only spell in all of Battle Magic that can improve your save on such a wide scale. Definitely another one you should be considering. So let's take a look at spell number 4, Gehenna's Golden Hounds. This is the second spell that can be affected by metal shifting. Then it's another magic missile. It has a range of 12 inches and a cast value of 9+, and targets a single enemy model, even a character in a unit. They suffer d6 hits as per the metal shifting lore attribute. Now you can boost the spell's range to 24 inches as well, and the cast value is increased to 12+ to do so. Now this is effectively a second Searing Doom, because enemy models that you target with this can take Lookout Sirs if they were the ones picked out of units. So if you think about targeting, say, a unit of enemy knights, you can target character in the regiment, they Lookout Sirs the knights, take some casualties, then you can drop the Searing Doom on them. That's pretty awesome. It's like doubling up your signature effect. I will say for this spell, however, its big weaknesses, there's some really, really gaping weaknesses, in fact. Firstly, it's always only d6 worth of hits, and that's just so frustrating when you roll a 1, or even a 2, to be honest. And the basic cast value's range of 12 is pretty poor, and it's exceptionally poor when you compare it to the other spells in this lore. On to spell number 5 now, Transmutation to Lead. This is our final Hex spell, and has a range of 24 inches and is cast on a 12+. It targets a single enemy unit, and they immediately subtract 1 from their weapon skill, ballistic skill, and armour save until the caster's next magic phase. You can also boost the range to 48 inches for a 15+ to cast. So this is actually quite flexible, targeting both combat and shooting units, plus it has good stackability with Plague of Rust for an immediate 2-point shift in the enemy armour save. Now, I've got to be honest, this spell tends to get a bit of hate, and I'm not really sure why, as it's super versatile and offers great synergy. Finally, we're going to take a look at spell number 6 now, and that's the final Transmutation. This one is a direct damage spell with a range of 18 inches. You roll a d6 for every model in the enemy unit, and on a roll of a 5+, they are removed from play with no save of any kind allowed. Now, multi-wound models are only affected on a roll of a 6. In addition, enemy units within 12 inches of the target at the start of the following turn, including the unit that you targeted with the spell, must take a stupidity test to avoid the allure of the cold statues you just created. It's cast on a 15 plus, but you can boost the range of this spell to 36 inches for a very reasonable casting value of only 18 plus, which gives it one of the largest ranges of any unit killer type spell in the whole game. I mean, what can I say? If you're not a multi-wound model, this spell will reliably kill 1/3 of your unit. This spell is literally as consistent against goblins as it is against Chaos Chosen, and that's consistency that you can build around competitively. You know what you're getting. Now, the stupidity can also be devastating as well, particularly as many of the armies that you'll face that have multi-wound models, well, they tend to have poor leadership. If you think of troll-heavy armies or ogres, they're not so scared about the kind of killing part of this spell. Only 1 in 6 of their models die, but they are quite concerned about all running towards the unit you just targeted. Not bad. So, we've seen that the Lore of Metal is a powerful all-round lore, improving the output and survivability of friendly units, whilst offering consistent debuffs and good damage to your enemies, especially the armoured variety. So let's get the rating for this lore. It gets a 4 for the variety of spell types, but it only gets a 2 for the power and frequency of the lore attribute. We're back to 4 for the spell range, 3 for spell flexibility, 2 for average casting value, and 2 for the quality of the signature spell, which gives the lore a total rating of 17 out of 24. Now I'm just going to take a moment to add that I treated Plague of Rust as a remains in play spell for the purposes of the score here. So let's move on now to getting the most out of the Lore of Metal on your wizards. The lore rating shows that although the spells in the Lore of Metal have fantastic range and variety, its high casting value and poor lore attribute are dominating considerations tactically. With this in mind, let's talk about the tactical tips you need to remember when using it in your games. Now, this section will be divided into 3 parts. The general tactics if you're using the Lore of Metal, and then some specific considerations for what level wizard you have it on. So that's maximising Lord levels, so level 4s, and sort of hero levels, level 2s, level 1s. Now, in general, there are some things you're going to want to do when using this lore. And the first one of those is you're going to need to ensure that you pack your army with units that can really benefit from your augment spells, as you can't control the amount of high armor save units your opponent is going to be able to bring to the table. So you can't be certain you're always going to be able to get the most out of your damage spells. Fortunately, almost every single army that has access to Lore of Metal has regiments that will fit into this sort of gaming profile, if you like. The second thing to consider links to the first point, and that's the positioning of your units. The cast values in this lore are quite high, and although you can boost the spells for impressive range, you don't want to have to do that too often, as you're going to want to conserve your dice for other spells. This is even more important if you roll Glittering Robe, as you're probably going to want to ensure that units can be grouped together so that they're all within 12 inches of each other for the wizard to offer the bubbled version to hit multiple friendlies. The third thing to consider is combined arms if you can. The Lore of Metal offers great buffs to both shooting and combat, and has some fantastic long-range damage potential with the signature spell and a final transmutation. Having the ability to shoot in the early turns to whittle down opponents' units is a great way to maximise all aspects of the Lore of Metal, with Glittering Robe and Transmutation of Lead offering protection against enemy missiles. Then, in the late game, dropping a big counter charge will allow you to further maximise Enchanted Blades, Plague of Rust, and again Transmutation to Lead. The final thing to consider about tactics is unit priority. Almost every spell in the Lore of Metal targets single units. Even when you boost the vast majority of them, you don't get to hit more units, just units that are further away. So you're going to need to think seriously about your opponent's crucial threats and accurately assess which of your units is going to gain the most benefit from a particular spell. This, in my opinion, is one of the hardest elements when maximising the Lore of Metal and gives the lore quite a high skill cap. This can be made easier sometimes if the enemy only has 1 or 2 units with a good armour save, for example, but I've got to stress, even a 4+ armour save should be considered a very viable target for things like Searing Doom or Gehenna's Hounds, especially if it's a lone model like a monster or a chariot. In fact, if I'm honest, I'd argue that's where the Gehenna's Golden Hounds in particular is at its very best. He's picking off lone monsters or chariots. If you do this well, you'll find that every spell in the Lore of Metal can deliver something in the game for you, and that you really can dispel the myth that Lore of Metal is only good against high armoured targets. So let's take a moment now to have a chat about the differences in tactics between a Lord level wizard with the Lore of Metal and a hero level wizard, or for the purposes of this, a level 4 and level 2. The level 4 wizard gives you the very best chance of scoring the Enchanted Blades and Glittering Robes, which, as we discussed, are the best choices for consistency. That's something you're going to want to consider. However, the bigger difference in tactics between a level 2 and level 4 is in fact spell casting. In general, boosting the spells in this lore is going to be helpful, particularly on Glittering Robe, Searing Doom and Final Transmutation, and I'd be looking to do that on those spells most of the time with my level 4. Conversely, with a level 2 or 1, I'd just stick to the base cast values primarily, as you'll be looking at 5 dice smashers to realistically cast the boosted versions of any of the spells we just looked at. In general, I steer away from low level Lore of Metal wizards in competitive play. I find the signature spell can be a bit too situational. I only have a 1 in 3 chance of rolling one of the 2 really consistent spells, that's Enchanted Blades and Glittering Robe, and the cast values are very high. The level 4 wizard, on the other hand, I think is a potent choice. So let's take a look now at the Lore of Metal and the armies as we move on to the final section of this video. So what I'm going to do here is take a brief look at each of the armies with the overall things to remember when using the Lore of Metal with them specifically. I want you to think of these as practical pointers for the tactics we just discussed in much more broad terms. High Elves. The Lore of Metal is a real underused resource for the armies of Ulthuan, as they can easily do a combined arms list, and they have a lot of units which can benefit from the Glittering Robe. A competitive Lore of Metal build would include Sisters of Avalon, Frostheart Phoenixes, Caradhrian on Ashtari, and almost any of the fighting infantry, but specifically White Lions, Phoenix Guards or Swordmasters rather than the core infantry. Improving the armour saves of all 3 of those elite infantry units that we just looked at to 3+ or 1+ against shooting for the White Lions is absolutely incredible. The Frostheart can also benefit too, as well their regular save is natural armour, which stacks in addition to scaly skin. The Enchanted Blades is immense on Sisters of Avalon for all of its effects, with the +1 to hit being incredible for White Lions as well, the armour piercing being great for Phoenix Guard, and well, all of it being awesome on Swordmasters. That's to say, +1 to hit and armour piercing both are particularly spicy on Swordmasters. Add into the fact that elite armies often need a unit killer spell against enemies that have a lot of models, and the Lore of Metal really seems to synergise well with the Azure. The spells you should be aiming for on your wizard are Glittering Robe, Enchanted Blades of Iban, and Final Transmutation. Also, for High Elves, I'd definitely take the Book of Hoeth on my level 4 on Lore of Metal as well. It really helps to combat the high cast values that we see in this lore. Dark Elves. Moving on to the Dark Elves now, and a lot of what we looked at with the High Elves transfers across here, with the notable exception of shooting units. The Dark Elf crossbows come with armour piercing baked in, so they get less benefit from Enchanted Blades. However, they do get a much greater impact from Plague of Rust as recompense, allowing them to effectively stack the negative modifier to armour save faster. Many of their characters will likely have Sea Dragon cloaks, so Glittering Robe should really be concentrated on your battle line blocks and crossbowmen. Witches and Executioners both get a great benefit from Enchanted Blades, whilst the crossbowmen and Executioners really come to life with Glittering Robe, as the Blackguard and Dark Riders, who can get to a 2+ armour save when affected by it. So these spells still remain really relevant, just slightly twisting the specific units they're best applied to. Dark Elves rely a little more on their spells for armour punch, as witches and blackguard can smash mass enemies, so taking Searing Doom should always be high on your list of considerations. Again, going with a level 4, you'd want to aim for Glittering Robes as a real priority, and then if you're going to go Combined Arms, I'd prioritise Plague of Rust probably as my second choice. After that, 2 of any of the remaining spells will be powerful, so look at what you're fighting against and use the matchup to determine which ones are going to be the most important for you. Wood Elves. We have to look at Wood Elves slightly differently to the way we just looked at High Elves and Dark Elves. The Lore of Metal is still fantastic on them because it actively combats one of their biggest issues, well-armoured enemies. However, it does have a bit of a drawback, and it's that beyond Wild Riders and Sisters of the Thorn, a competitive Wood Elf build with plenty of small units of Glade Guards, Scouts, and Wild Riders and Sisters of the Thorn struggle to benefit from the 2 main augments in your army. You're hyper-mobile usually, and this means you'll often struggle to keep the Glittering Robe bubble over multiple units. And Enchanted Blades will struggle to have a meaningful impact when your average unit size is 10 models or less. This means that if we're going to take the Lore of Metal for its armour busting and unit killing potential, we need to think about how we build the rest of our army to help maximise some of those other spells. In this case, 2 units of 20 Glade Guard with Hagbane tips will be better than 4 units of 10, and you will want to commit your Wild Riders into combat in waves rather than all at once. So this will ensure that you can apply hexes and augments to each unit of Wild Riders to maximise their damage, rather than putting it all in at once and only being able to buff 1. For Wood Elves, the priority spells should always be Searing Doom and Final Transmutation, as they struggle to kill well-armoured targets or units with lots of models. Beyond this, Enchanted Blades, Plague of Rust and Gehennas are all very strong spells for the same reasons that we looked at a minute ago. The Empire. The humans have arrived, and the Lore of Metal is very interesting for the Empire. As they have access to a lot of 1+ armour save units, and their non-artillery shooting units are relatively poor, Metal might not seem like an obviously good choice. However, Swordsmen and Greatswords are phenomenal grind units when combined with the Lore of Metal's augment spells. Outriders can become a powerful shooting unit, particularly if you take larger units of them, and Metal provides an incredible unit killer for those enemy units that you simply won't be able to take out with the conventional elements of an Empire army. The magical attacks from Enchanted Blades is also great, as Empire struggle to get them into a competitive army build. However, what makes this so interesting for the Empire is that they can take Balthazar Gelt, the supreme patriarch of the Lore of Metal. Now, if you're looking at the Lore of Metal for an Empire wizard, just find the points for Balthazar Gelt. You won't be disappointed. He's a lore master, so you can build your list knowing you always have access to the spells you want, and he gets an additional +2 to his casting attempt, which massively combats the higher cast values found in the Lore of Metal. Incidentally, that improves the Lore of Metal's rating to a 19 when taken on Balthazar Gelt. Seriously strong. Not only that, when you've got units like a Celestial Hurricanum that gives you 3 power dice every turn, you're combating the high cast values even more, and the Hurricanum gives out a +1 to hit bubble of its own, meaning that you can get more units with +1 to hit, or you can stack up for +2 to hit. The Lore of Metal really does have some great options for the armies of Karl Franz. Lizardmen. Like with the High Elves, I think the Lore of Metal is potentially a bit of an underused gem for Lizardmen. Okay, you aren't really going to see the benefit of Glittering Robe, because most of your units come with Scaly Skin already, but Plague of Rust and Transmutation of Lead have great synergy with the baked-in Strength 4 of Saurus Warriors. The Enchanted Blades is universally good on an army that struggles to hit with both shooting and combat attacks. The Lizardmen in general find enemy elite infantry a bit of an issue in combat as well, due to their relatively poor weapon skill and average sort of strength 4 and at best 5 strength really. They often feel a little short against well-armoured targets as well. These issues means a standard Lizardmen army with a block of Saurus, Temple Guard and some shooting skinks will really synergise with the Lore of Metal. Teto would be a fantastic addition to this list as well, as he allows the Slann to reroll 1s when making casting attempts, helping once again to combat those higher than average casting values. The priority spells for Full Metal Frog, as he shall be known, are Enchanted Blades and Final Transmutation. Then I'd pay special attention to the Plague of Rust and Searing Doom against well-armoured opponents, or Transmutation to Lead against lower armoured enemies. Demons of Chaos. We move on to the twisted powers of Chaos now, and we're starting with the Demons. Lore of Metal has some really strong synergy with Demons, although it's not as obvious as with some of the other armies we've discussed, and it's crucial that you really maximise it, as you're going to need to mix gods in your list, because the Lore of Metal is only available to Tzeentch demons, and the spells, well, generally affect the demons from other gods the best. I'd try as much of a combined arms list as I could, with a large unit of Flamers of Tzeentch, and a Skull Cannon or two, to ground my army in a ranged threat. The biggest synergy winners with the Lore of Metal are Demonettes, Bloodletters, and Plague Bearers, combined with Plague of Rust and Transmutation of Lead. This makes the most of their higher weapon skill, or their -1 to hit modifier respectively, thanks to the lowering of enemy weapon skills with the Transmutation to Lead, and really helps to maximise the casualties these blocks will cause, because you're dropping enemy armour saves by 2 points in that combination. Plague Bearers, the Lord of Change, and Flamers also hugely benefit from the Enchanted Blades. That being said, those 3 spells, Enchanted Blades, Transmutation to Lead, and Plague of Rust, would be my initial aims, although if an enemy is particularly well armoured, I might prioritise Searing Doom instead of one of them. Final Transmutation is always incredible to have in the hull, especially in a take-on-all-comers list, as it really helps out against that massive threat that is the Banner of the World Dragon. Warriors of Chaos. On to the Warriors of Chaos now, and arguably one of the best armies to use the Lore of Metal with. With a low model count and good basic armour values, Warriors can really multiply their power with the Augments, Hexes, and direct damage spells from this lore. Like with the Demons core units, Warriors of Chaos with the Mark of Nurgle and Halberds gain many benefits from the Lore of Metal. Increasing their saving throw to a 2+ in combat, or a 1+ against shooting, making them weapon skill 5, strength 5 with armour piercing and +1 to hit, lowering your opponent's saving throws and weapon skill to maximise your impressive stats and Mark of Nurgle. In a real sense, there isn't a bad spell in the Lore of Metal for a Warriors of Chaos army. But if you're taking the Lore of Metal, you're going to want to include a unit of Warriors of Chaos, as we just described how powerful they get in that combination. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say I'd make it a good size one too, and I'd make a point of getting the Crown of Command in there, as in a protracted combat, this combination of spells and equipment will ensure that they grind almost any foe out. Also, this helps to prevent your opponent getting a lucky charge on them when you haven't got buffs on them and just running them down. They don't benefit as obviously as some of the other factions from Searing Doom or Gehenna's Hounds, as they have some good alternatives to them, but any of the remaining 5 spells will really help your army to sing competitively. Combine that unit of warriors with some trolls, monsters or skull crushers to build a foundation of an incredibly strong Lore of Metal centric list. Chaos Dwarves, Legion of Asgore. Finally we have the Chaos Dwarves. Like the Warriors of Chaos, the core Dwarves really benefit from all of the augments and hexes in the Lore of Metal. So I'd get a unit of Chaos Dwarf warriors in my list to exploit that straight away. With Plague of Rust, Transmutation of Lead, Enchanted Blades and Glittering Robe all combining to make them hit often and make more of their damage stick to the enemy whilst being very hard to shift in return. When running this type of combination, adding an Infernal Castellan to the unit will make the regiment stubborn, and that is clearly going to be a good choice. This means that your opponent's going to have to avoid them or kill them to the dwarf, the latter being an exceptionally difficult task when you start buffing them with this lore. In addition, I take a large block of hobgoblins as an anvil unit to accompany these guys as well. I'd be looking to deploy them in the bus, so 5 wide and maybe 8 deep. And I'd be looking to combine up the Glittering Robe and the Transmutation of Lead in a very similar way to that we just discussed with the Chaos Dwarf Warriors. This powerful combination on them will mean that they can become a really tanky regiment for your army, and they'll help to stop that block of Chaos Dwarves being overwhelmed if your opponent has a large number of units. Both of these units can be used to pin something down as well, to be flanked by something like your Kodai Destroyer or your Sorcerer Prophet on Baal Taurus, both of which also get a huge boost from Enchanted Blades. So my priority spells for a Chaos Dwarf army would be Glittering Robe, Enchanted Blades and Transmutation to Lead. The perfect set would probably be completed by Final Transmutation, which works well as another long-range threat to complement your artillery, but as we all know, you don't always get the 4 you want, and those first 3 are the ones you should be swapping for or grabbing if you can. To conclude, the Lore of Metal is strong and versatile, but does require some skill from you to get the most out of it. Its 17 out of 24 rating shows it's got a lot of potential in competitive play, but also reminds us that we need to think seriously about its casting values and situational lore attribute when building our army lists. As ever, I hope that this has given you some great ideas or tactical options to try out in your next game with the Lore of Metal. Please feel free to get in touch with us through our social media or comment on the videos with your thoughts about the Lore of Metal, and then make sure you head back to the Knight of the Realm mustering ground to check out all of our other exclusive content. I'll see you next time on 20 Tactics. Thanks for joining me.
Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share. Then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
You alright? Do it for Warhammer!